Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments onto whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and they will show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. I hope that you're having a wonderful Monday. We have had an interesting weekend. And I'm going to continue my talk on the subject of leadership. And my particular point today is the idea of choosing your battles. And this was inspired in ways that should be obvious from the weekend. And it's kind of a continuation of what I was saying the other day about keeping things in proper perspective. So we're going to be talking about that today. But before we get to it, I want to say that in response to viewers' requests, we will be re-airing best of Reverend Don's vlogs starting tomorrow morning. There will be one vlog per day at 5 a.m. So it should be available all through the day. Should be a good time for some of our overseas people to catch it, quote, live, and should be available online all day long for everyone everywhere. So, and also certainly our earliest programming of the day. Now, of course, oh, and hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. It is worth saying that the best of Reverend Don's vlog that will be airing tomorrow, which is called Blood Bond 2, what has not actually been, quote, live, end quote, since September 12th of 2012, or 12 Aquarius. But that's the point of being a best of. And hello to Janet in the chat room. Hello to Janet Winston. Hello to Janet Gann. It's good to see you both. And hello to Arlene in the chat room. And hello to Lolan and Gwenny in the chat room. It's good to see all of you. And we will be having one best of Reverend Don's vlog each day for weekdays. And I'm going to take them in order, starting from the one we're beginning with, at least initially, and we'll see how people react to them. The other thing I want to say, you know, I've been involved with Gaia Thrift, and we've been taking donations. I do want to say that I am now looking for metaphysical donations, metaphysical books, and other items, and tarot cards, things like that. And the purpose of this, a few of them will be put back into permanent collections, but for the most part, the idea is to sell them to support elder care and other projects that we're working on through Gaia Thrift and so forth. So if you have any that you're looking to donate, consider us. And you can instant message me on Facebook or email me at donlewishp@aol.com and make arrangements for that if you have anything you'd like to donate. And finally, if you'd like to support my work, the best way to do that is through my Patreon, which you can find at revdonlewis.com. And with that, let us get on to our subject, which is choose your battles. And what do I mean by choose your battles? I spoke the other day, and I've spoken several days, about how so often in the pagan community, people fight over nonsense and waste all of their energy. The truth of the matter is, even when you're young, you feel like you have endless energy. You do not. Your organizations certainly do not. There is always a certain limit to your energy, and you want to use it in ways that make sense. You do not want to throw away your time, your passion, and your effort on nonsense. And yet people do it every day. They get caught up in their emotions very often. And in our community, they often get caught up in trivia. And hello to Mary Hawk in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. And the idea of reserving their energies for what's important doesn't often seem to occur to a lot of people, but it's a vital technique of leadership. No matter who you are, And hello to Reverend Michael in the chat room. You can find all kinds of nonsense to involve yourself in, especially if you're in social media. It's there all day long. You can argue over irrelevancies. You can get into protracted discussions of nonsense. But doing that will get you nothing, except maybe a little emotional satisfaction. And, I'm not saying that emotional satisfaction is never worth the doing. It depends on the amount of investment. But when we're talking about an organization or a person who is in a position of leadership, how you invest your resources, how you invest your time is actually very important, because there's only so much of it. And, I can tell you on a daily basis, I barely have time for the things that I'm obliged to do as it is, without involving myself in all kinds of other things. It is important to stay focused on what matters. This is true in terms of your, quote, battles, end quote, but also everything you're doing. And in a manner of speaking, when I say choose your battles, I also mean your activities, your priorities, everything. Think about what's going to be of benefit. And this is especially true in cases of conflict. And I've talked about the identity wars of the 90s and early 2000s on many occasions. The number one tragedy of those wars was there was nothing to be won. At best, there were some minor bragging rights involved in the various different fights, but they did absolutely nothing for the positions of the different groups in the real world. They did nothing to advance the civil rights of the community. They did nothing to hold back the enemies of our community, which hopefully everybody realizes there are some. These things just wasted time and energy and people. Because very often what happened is that large numbers of people left the community because of these wars, either because they were on the losing side and lost hope for their future in the community, or they were watching it and just looked at it and said, I don't want to be involved in something like this. And, it's hard to avoid this sort of thing ever happening. Because people are people, and people will fight over nothing. But if you're in a position of leadership, you never want to encourage it. And the best response is usually to ignore it if you can, and let those who want to fight over scraps go fight over them. You cannot stop them. You cannot make peace among them. And hello to Fox Fur Witch and to Lynn Townsend in the chat room. It's good to see you both. It would be nice to think that you could make peace among them. And I'm not going to say there's never an occasion. But generally speaking, if they want to fight, they're going to fight. But what you can do is control your own reaction to the situation and pick your battle according to whether it merits your involvement and rewards your involvement. If there is nothing to be gained by being involved in a fight, argument, or discussion, why on earth would you want to be involved in it? If you cannot convince the other side, if you cannot bring peace to the situation, if you cannot do anything to advance the situation, why would you waste your time? And yet people do every day. And yes, granted, there are times when it's perfectly fine to make a remark. I mean, that one of the things I follow extensively are archaeological, what would you call them, archaeological accounts on social media, which feature archaeological finds and artwork. And occasionally I'll make a comment, either clarifying something or correcting what I understand to be someone else's mistake, but usually not, because I perceive it as being a muddy slope. But Occasionally I will do it because I'm human, and occasionally it's good. Occasionally people are happy for additional information. Um, but generally, what would be the point? I saw one this morning comparing the back of the famous bust of Nefertiti to the entryway to the tomb of Ramesses II. An interesting thought, but clearly irrelevant in part because part of the scene of Ramesses' tomb entrance is entirely modern. The entry walkway is completely modern. The idea that there's any kind of relationship between these two things is pretty silly when you come down to it. But the idea of stopping to say that was also rather silly. I didn't do it. So another one, at the risk of telling you more than you need to know about such things, but it was the sculpture of a man's head dated to the 5th dynasty. And they talked about the wig that he is wearing being what they used to date it to the time. Except the problem is, there's no reason to think it would have been a wig in the 5th dynasty. The idea that Egyptians shaved their heads and always wore wigs is completely false. It is true for certain eras, and it's true for certain professions, such as part of the priesthood. But it's certainly not true across the board. And there's no reason to think this man would be wearing a wig. But that would be, in my opinion, a time waster to have bothered to remark on this post, particularly since it seemed to have 400 posts from one person on completely different subjects. But that's beside the point. It definitely did not seem like something to put my time into. Now, these are frivolous examples. But you shouldn't need a lot of help to think of more relevant examples of situations where people are in disagreement or arguing over things that to intrude yourself into is only going to waste your time. And, granted, some of us have far more time than others. But when we're talking about leadership, we're not only talking about the time of the person, but also other people in that organization who may get swept into it. And, you always have to ask yourself, is this worth doing? Am I doing it for a good reason? Am I doing it for emotional satisfaction? Generally speaking, as a leader, that is not a good reason. Am I doing it because I think they're wrong? Well, then the next question is, well, does that affect me and people I'm working with? And is there anything wrong with their being wrong over there? And, I kind of come from the point of view that, if you want to have a different opinion, go ahead and have that opinion. And if it's something that I think is wrong, well, generally speaking, I'm not too concerned about that, not least of which because although I think I'm right, I'm mindful of the fact I could turn out to be wrong. And then, of course, there's the question, well, is this opinion we're talking about anything of importance? Now, occasionally, I will make a comment on something that I think is of importance. And, of course, I'm not really talking about just making random comments. I'm talking about entering into actual conflicts. And generally speaking, you just shouldn't do it. If you're going to do it, make sure that it's something you should be doing. And also, that it offers you something for your time. I mean, if you're just going in to defend a position, well, sometimes that's worth doing. Some time ago, there was a conflict over who was the oldest pagan channel available online. And it is Corellian TV, then called Magic TV. There is no stretch of the imagination by which there is any other. And yes, we did feel it necessary to say that. However, we didn't make too big a deal of it or go after it very long. But what I did do is I made a special talking about all of our years in doing this with video clips to back it up. And if someone else wants to go back and say their 2 years of history is longer than our 19 years of history, just under 20, well, they can do that, but it's not going to look particularly good for them because it's obviously not true. I don't have to sit here and stamp my foot over it. But it was necessary to say it. But getting into a full-blown war over it would have been silly. That's what I mean by picking your battles. Sometimes you may have to say something, but is it really worth any kind of major conflict? Usually it's not. Now, when we're talking about the civil rights of our community, that's always worth a major conflict. Sometimes more than others. But, I think back to Patrick McCollum and his years of battling for the rights of prisoners in the U.S. prison system. That was a major battle, one that we did a number of reports on and did our best to support at the time. And, that was worth every moment of it, especially because he did win in the end. And although there were pagan priesthood working with pagan prisoners even before he won that battle, it was very location dependent. But when he won the battle, it became possible all across the country. And if you are a pagan prison minister, you owe a debt of thanks to Patrick McCollum and to other people who worked in that battle. That was a battle worth choosing. If you're arguing over which quarter to start casting your circle in, that is not a battle worth fighting. That is simply a personal or a tradition difference. If you're arguing about what element to assign the wand or the athame or other magical tools to, that's not a battle, that's just a disagreement. And it's a disagreement that goes back centuries because these things don't come from a single source. Speaking, for example, about the assignment of magical tools and elements, there are a variety of sources for this, including grimoire magic, including the tarot, including ceremonial magic, and they never agree. So of course they don't agree in magical practice in the modern world. And in my opinion, it's simply a matter of what works best for you or your tradition. And the idea of anyone fighting over it is a waste of time. And yet, throughout the 90s and early 2000s, there were full-blown wars over this nonsense. This is what I mean by choose your battles. Choose the battles that make a difference. What on earth is the good of expending vast amounts of energy, possibly destroying people and groups in the process, possibly destroying your own group in the process, over trivia? Because in the end, the things like I just mentioned, assigning the elements to magical items, that's trivia when all is said and done. Civil rights? No. That's something serious that affects us. One of the things I point out to people, none of this is permanent. It all grows and changes. And if you look at magical practice 100 years ago, it does not resemble in every aspect magical practices today. A great deal has happened in that 100 years. If you look at magical practices 100 years earlier, a lot happened then too. If you look at the magical practices of the ancient world, a lot has changed since then. Now, there's also a lot that has survived, but a lot has changed. And if you think 100 years from now, people are going to be doing exactly what we do, I've got news for you. Nothing historically supports that point of view. Now, is part of what we're going to do still going to be there? Well, yes, part of what we do will certainly survive, but other things will change according to what people choose to do. One of the things I was speaking about not too long ago is the use of sage in smoke purification or sensing. When I was taught back in the 70s, this was generally not done in Wiccan practice. Was purification by smoke done? Well, yes, it was. Sensing more commonly used things like frankincense or myrrh or other more traditional European styles of incense. It was in the late 70s and early 80s people started to use sage because of Native American practice and because of a rather large outreach on the part of the Native American community that a lot of people choose to forget about now, to convince other people to do this, which was remarkably successful. I personally think that we were better using a wider range of things and certainly should, to some extent, return to that practice, although I see nothing wrong with sage. You'll notice if you read any of my works, I speak about using sage in various ways, but I never specify white sage. That came in after my education. The kind of sages that we used tended to be other varieties. But this is part of how things change. So if you're going to fight about something, don't fight about minor changes. They're naturally going to happen. It's just part of being alive. I see people talking in some areas excessively, and particularly like in the 1980s, about the Celtic origins of modern witchcraft, which was basically unheard of when I was being trained, and is basically a red herring, in my opinion. There's a little truth there. There is some things that could be said to that, but usually not the way people are saying. The origins of modern witchcraft are very universal, as for the most part is modern witchcraft, as well as highly differentiated in many different forms. But this is, again, just part of the territory. And the idea of arguing that we all need to be the same, or that we all came from one thing, or that we must all be following the exact same practices is foolish. Certainly with a view toward history, because that's never what happens. Things never stay the same. If you look at the Christian religion, which has tended to be the culturally dominant religion for a very long time, they don't stay the same over one century to another. If you look at Christian religion in the present era versus 1900, there are vast changes. And if you look back to 1800, vast changes. And if you look back to 1700, bigger changes. And if you look back to 1600, you wouldn't recognize it for the most part. And if you look back to the early Christians, maybe if you're Orthodox, you'd recognize part of it. Most Western Christians would not really recognize it. Now, Arlene in the chat room has a question. In regards to sage, what are your thoughts about cultural appropriation that is so much talked about today? I think it's nonsense. I think sage is a plant commonly used in the New World. We do not use it in Western magic in the same way that Native Americans do anyway. What Native Americans use the English term smudging for is very different from the kind of smoke cleansing that, for example, Wiccans do. They barely coincide with one another. Why we would not use a plant found in the New World, I don't see. Though, as I say, I'd rather see us go back to a wider range of plants, which is more traditional to us. I am not worried about it, but then I'm a great believer in the fact that we're constantly developing and borrowing from one another anyway. So if you ask me, am I concerned about it? No. Now, if you are If you're dressing up in buckskin and indulging in Native American stereotypes while you do it, that's a whole other matter. That is cultural appropriation, and I would consider that inappropriate. But just using sage, I don't see that. And as I say, we don't use it the way they use it anyway. And as for the word smudge, I'd rather see us discontinue using that and go back to the more traditional word of censing or cleansing by smoke, which is what it was called when I was trained. But smudge is still an English word. And what does it mean historically? It means exactly what we're using it for. Treating something with smoke. So I think a great deal more is made of it than needs to be. I do think one of the things I've heard suggested about the use of white sage is that so many people in the wider population using it makes it more difficult for people of Native American ancestry to get it. I think that's a very valid point. And again, I'd rather see us using, again, frankincense, myrrh, other sorts of sage and cedar and various herbs that we might more traditionally have used. And I think that would be a very appropriate thing on our part. But am I all upset about people using sage? No, I think that's silly. And I think that's one of the kinds of trivia that people get into huge wars about, that for the most part we really shouldn't be getting into. And I have watched people get into huge wars over things that would be very easily corrected if anyone would take the time to correct it, very easily addressed if anyone would attempt to address it. And I've just told you how to address this if you have an issue with it. The reason, in my opinion, that so many people practicing different forms of Western occultism use sage is, one, because of that heavy outreach in the 60s, 70s, and 80s from certain Native American teachers to convince people to use it, together with the fact it's been extremely well marketed, and you can find it everywhere. It's the marketing that caused it to be well used. I've never really liked it, to be honest, because I think that it works far less effectively than more traditional Western incenses. And sage often throws little sparks, or the sage bundles people like to use often throw little sparks that can be dangerous. I would rather, on my own, I would rather use powdered incense. But stick incense works perfectly fine. You can get it in virtually any sort, including sage. And yeah, I see, firstly, no reason to get upset about it, but also it's not something I would personally make my preferred preference. That was not the most mellifluous turn of phrase, but you know what I mean. But then I love variety. I love to set up my altar in different ways for different occasions. If you watched my videos over the years that included altars, you'll notice they frequently change. And I've known other people who would love to keep their altar exactly the same. Nothing would make me happier than using 20 different kinds of incense and 20 different 20 different rituals. And Gwenny says, people seem to have plenty of energy to point out differences, don't they? And too bad they don't use that energy to find similarities and peace. Well, that's my point for today. Choose your battles. And, this one about sage is a perfect example. Is it the practice I prefer? No. Am I going to make any issues about it? No. It's not worth my time and effort. I can't change it. So why should I take any particular action towards it, except by example? And if people like to follow my example, then they might choose some other more traditional Western incense for their sensing purposes. And but argue about it? That's silly. And it helps nothing, solves nothing, and just wastes energy. And that, again, was the purpose of today's conversation. Don't waste your energy. If you're going to find yourself arguing over something, argue over something important that helps people and moves things forward. And this comes under the heading of what I always like to say: do the next right thing. Don't fritter your energy away. Use it in good and positive ways to make good and positive changes. With that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I thank you for joining me. I'll be back tomorrow. And tomorrow I'll be talking about some other aspect of leadership. And then on Wednesday, I'll be doing mini readings again. So have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining me, and let us close with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to always find that next right thing. Help us not to squander our energies in fruitless arguments, but rather to advance the causes that have true meaning in our lives and help ourselves and our people to move forward. Help us to find and maintain our focus and to use it in good and positive ways. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks. And knowing you are always with us, still from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always. I thank you